Hello and welcome to the Team Called Palace podcast. For the very first time, you are not only listening but also watching this because it's up on our YouTube channel. We are chatting the season so far for Crystal Palace FC. I'm Ben Watts, aka Face for Radio. Should have got a haircut before doing this. And he's Matt Watts. He's done webcams loads of times before, mainly as a pundit, nothing like that. So let's crack on with the chatter. And we're going to take you back to the start of the Premier League season and kick things off, Matt, with a victory against Sheffield United.
Yeah, so on the first game of the season, we went up to Bramall Lane. Obviously, a season opener against a newly promoted side is always tricky, but we managed to get the 1-0 win. A Jordan Ayew assist for Odsonne Edouard, wearing our jazzy new black third kit. A really good start to the campaign.
And it was one of those games, wasn't it, Matt, that on paper was a potential banana skin with Bramall Lane rocking, with Sheffield United being back in the top flight. So to get the result there, albeit they'd had some transfer business during that week where they'd obviously lost a couple of their better players, still though a fine result.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's a really good point because usually when you're away from home against a newly promoted side, first game of the season, you would take a point. But when you bear in mind the players that Sheffield United lost, the likes of Iliman Ndiaye, Sander Berger, they were a little bit weaker. Obviously, they signed Gus Harmer, but he only signed just before the game. So I think that played into our hands. So yeah, a really good win. And also a really strong debut from Jefferson Lerma as well. Obviously, our new signing from Bournemouth. He settled into that midfield really nicely alongside Cheick Doucouré. When you look at the underlying numbers, we were by far and away the better side. And if anything, 1-0 actually flattered Sheffield United.
And obviously, we followed that up with a defeat at home against Arsenal, and ultimately a frustrating one. That
Yeah, it was because we played fairly well and we did a good job of keeping Arsenal out in the first half. Obviously, in the second half, there was the penalty, Sam Johnson bringing down Eddie Nketiah. He probably didn't need to go for it, which made it all the more frustrating. Martin Odegaard slotted it in. Of course, Arsenal went down to 10 men. Tomiyasu got sent off, 2 yellow cards. The second one in particular was rather soft. But yeah, unfortunately, we just couldn't find the breakthrough. Arsenal were very, very solid. Declan Rice sitting in front of their two centre halves. They did look really good. They managed to keep us out. It was frustrating, but I think when you look at those two opening fixtures, you can kind of accept a victory over Sheffield United, followed by a defeat against Arsenal.
yeah, ultimately you would expect those two results to play out the way they did. The frustration for me would be the fact that, as you've mentioned, the penalty itself was needless. It was avoidable. Obviously, that's how they open the scoring. And then once they go down to 10 men, Palace had a lifeline and, put Arsenal under plenty of pressure, but without ultimately creating that real chance that you would say should have been taken to equalise in the game.
Yeah, and I think it's a theme that I'm sure we're going to mention a couple of times in this video, the fact that we were chasing the game. And when you look at the players we brought off the bench, possibly not quite enough firepower. Obviously, Jezrak Saki came on, had a couple of nice moments. But when you look at our bench, we don't have those options, especially with the likes of Michael Elise out and Matthias França not available yet. So, yeah, it was frustrating. I do think that Arsenal did actually defend really well. So you do also need to give them some credit too.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Actually, Arsenal did defend well. And speaking of good defensive performances and, if you will, two teams cancelling one another out, we've spoken about how the results were predictable, so to speak, for the first couple. Well, who'd have thought a draw against Brentford would happen? It was the obvious result, wasn't it?
Yeah, it really was. We always seem to draw with Brentford. They are always incredibly tight games. Obviously, we fell behind in this one. An excellent goal from Kevin Schade. He turned Joel Ward inside out before firing it into the roof of the net. But yeah, in the second half, we managed to come back into it. A fantastic goal from our own Scandinavian against the Scandi Mafia, Joachim Andersen. A lovely goal where he's passed the ball into Jordan Ayew, Ayu's kind of laid it off, flicked it around the corner. Anderson's run onto it, and a really good finish from him. Obviously, Joachim Anderson's had an excellent start to the season. He was someone that Brentford actually wanted to sign in the summer. I think they were talking about £30 million, which quite clearly isn't anywhere near enough.
Yeah, and I guess that's a good point to mention that obviously there was plenty of interest in some of our players over the course of the summer transfer window, the likes of Anderson, the likes of Guéhi at the heart of the defence, as well as obviously Michael Elise, who clearly we haven't seen so far due to injury, but there was that saga with Chelsea and the possibility that he might go there. Eze has obviously stayed with Zaha leaving. So the fact that we have been able to keep so many of those players at the club, Doucouré too, with some late interest from Liverpool, obviously bodes well, but it did also mean we didn't necessarily have the funds to reinvest in the team.
Yeah, obviously we want to keep hold of our best players, but at some point in the future, we are going to need to sell some of these players. And I would like to think that we're going to sell them for a lot of money, a lot more than we certainly bought them for. That is going to be the model moving forwards. As you said, this summer, there wasn't a big departure, and that did probably impact our spending a bit in the transfer window. I do think that next summer, there'll be one, if not two players moving on for big money. And yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how we do reinvest that.
Yeah, obviously there was the will he, won't he situation with Wilfred Zaha, and obviously eventually he did decide to move on to Galatasaray. Our final game before the first international break was at home against Wolves, and another team perhaps that had a slightly stunted summer transfer window in terms of bringing players in. They did do some business fairly late on with a couple of player sales, but going into that one, Matt, it felt like it was the kind of game where we needed to get 3 points.
Yeah, it did. And I think when you look at those first three games, you'd say that we were probably par for the course, having 4 points on the board. So to win that one against Wolves for the international break, really important win. Obviously, Odsonne Edouard bagged a couple. Eberechi Eze got his first goal of the season as well. There was a really important impact off the bench from Jean-Philippe Mateta, who of course starred in the win over Plymouth during that week. So yeah, a really good win. Important to get 3 goals. I think the quality of some of the goals as well. I mean, Mitchell's ball in for Edouard for the first, some lovely link-up play between Mateta and Eze for the second. And then the third one, the kind of run into the box from Edouard, the layoff from Mateta, that link-up play. You know, we've spoken about it so many times on the podcast over the years. Is it Edouard or is it Mateta? Well, on the basis of that performance, we're starting to think that it's both of them because, yeah, it was a really impressive one. Obviously, this game also came off the back of deadline day. So we kind of thought there might be some attacking additions before the end of the window. There wasn't. We spent £20 million on Dean Henderson and we bought in Rob Holding as well, which is something that we've spoken about a number of times over the last few weeks. But yeah, it did send us into the international break in a really good spot. And also, I think it's worth mentioning that in those first 4 games, we had the same starting lineup each time, which is obviously a luxury that simply hasn't been afforded to Roy in the last few weeks.
Yeah, and we've spoken about it on our regular podcast, the fact that in hindsight, that money spent on Dean Henderson with the injury that he then picked up in the League Cup game and the lack of attacking reinforcements and the injuries that we've had, that clearly has been, you know, money not necessarily well spent and would have been better served in other areas. And we obviously were chasing a striker on deadline day, as you mentioned, which didn't materialize. There wasn't a plan B in that sense to bring someone else in. And the game against Wolves off the back of it, and obviously Mateta's efforts against Plymouth, as you mentioned, it was a strange one to almost digest in a way because, you know, we'd potentially been expecting Mateta to be heading out the exit door. And here he was coming off the bench off the back of scoring that hat-trick in midweek to then provide, you know, such a telling contribution and combine with Edouard in the way that he did. You know, those two guys, we spent much of last season on the podcast saying, you know, which one is it? Who should be our main striker? And they've never really had a chance to play as a pair. And they seemed to sort of really strike up a relationship in that game.
Yeah, they did. And it's been a recurring theme in the last few weeks, hasn't it? The link up play between Mateta and Edouard. I think one of the reasons why we haven't seen that much of it is simply because we haven't had any other striking options. There's been a few times in recent weeks when the injuries have kicked in, people have said we need to start Edouard and Mateta. And I completely understand that because of the link up play that we have seen. But if you do that, then you don't have another senior striker on the bench. So maybe if we did have a few more options in that area of the pitch, you might have seen it in the past. I think also when you look at our best 11, obviously last season you'd argue that you'd have Zaha on the left, maybe Ebbs in a kind of advanced midfield role, Michael Elise on the right. That doesn't really leave room for Odsonne Edouard to play that little bit deeper. We've seen him play on the left in the past and he's looked quite good there. And then in recent weeks, we have seen him kind of in a number 10 role. And I do actually think that that suited him. I kind of feel as though in a way that not having to be the main man, not having to be the battering ram as such up against the two opposition centre halves, being that little bit deeper in the space has actually suited him. And I think we saw that perfectly with the third goal against Wolves when he picks up that ball a bit deeper, he plays it into Mateta, he drives into the box and he scores. I do actually think that role does really suit him.
Yeah, and it's obviously been great to see Odsonne Edouard flourishing at the start of this campaign and really finding his scoring boots too, as he did in that game against Aston Villa, which ultimately ended in defeat, and one of those where we were left slightly ruining a soft penalty, which turned the game somewhat.
Yeah, it was a soft penalty. This was Darren England's blunder before the big Darren England blunder, wasn't it? I mean, yeah, we weren't 1-0 up in the game. Again, fantastic link-up play between Mateta and Edouard. Another low cross into Edouard, which has been a kind of theme of the early weeks of the campaign. You don't really associate crossing with a Roy Hodgson side, but in the early weeks of the campaign, that's been a real route to goal for Palace, those low crosses into Edouard. Yeah, I mean, John Duran's goal was absolutely outstanding. If you score a goal like that, you know, you probably are worthy of taking something out of the game. But obviously, as Palace fans, it's what happened after that penalty that was given against Chris Richards. It did seem very harsh. It was the sort of penalty that wouldn't have been given down the other end, I think, to be honest with you. I think it was a home penalty. And then, yeah, obviously they get the third goal after that. But even the penalty, there was some controversy about that, wasn't there? Because one of the Villa players was miles in the box when Douglas Luiz actually takes the penalty. You know, if you're going to have the rules, you need to enforce them properly. But listen, I think going to Villa Park is always tough. They've got a fantastic home record under Unai Emery. And I think also, obviously, the injuries we picked up in that international break, it was kind of the start of a trend, wasn't it? Mark Gahey picking up the injury for England, Jefferson Lerma, of course, being injured when he went away to Colombia. That did leave us a little bit shorter. And listen, no offence to Will Hughes or to Chris Richards, but I do feel a lot more confident and more comfortable when we've got Doucouré and Lerma sitting in front of Gahey and Anderson.
And obviously that was one of the mitigating factors, if you will, for the goalless draw at home against Fulham, which, you know, looking at that fixture at the start of the campaign, we'd have been marking it down as a potential home win, the sort of game that you would like to think we can collect 3 points from if we're at our best form on the day. But in the end, we did well perhaps to get a draw out of it, and it looked like on the balance of chances that maybe an away win might have happened.
Yeah, as you say, I think at the start of the campaign, you look at that fixture and you think that's one where we'd like to be picking up 3 points. Obviously, they beat us convincingly at home last season in that nightmare after Christmas. But yeah, I do think that when you look at the two sides, if we had our best players available, you'd like to think we'd push on and try and win that game. As you said, I thought Fulham were actually the better side on the day. I thought they were on top for much of the second half. Again, it comes back to bench options. We didn't really have the options off the bench to come on and change that game. Obviously, it was great having Mark Gahey back. He made our defence look a lot more solid. But yeah, unfortunately, in those kind of games where someone like Iberi Eze is a little bit quiet, we kind of lack a little bit of inspiration at the minute, given the fact that we still don't have Michael Elise and, of course, Matthias França.
And then, of course, we had 2 trips up to Old Trafford in the space of a few days. And particularly after the first outing, the League Cup aberration, if you will, where we were just terrible, and Manchester United walks through to the next round with relative ease. Going into the Premier League game, you'd have been forgiven for thinking that exactly the same was going to play out, albeit that Manchester United had a fairly average start to the season, and a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes and off the field as well that was having an impact on who Erik ten Hag was able to pick, etc. But to go there and get the result we did was really quite something.
Yeah, it was. And I mean, I think we called our podcast for this one the Palace Strike Back, because it did feel like we were on our knees after that Carabao Cup defeat. We had a bit of chat during that week, didn't we, about whether or not we should go harder in the Carabao Cup or whether we should go harder in the Premier League. I still think that the cup competitions are going to be our best possible route into Europe in future, but I do kind of understand the pragmatism, because when you look at the injuries we've picked up since, for a club like Palace, the first aim is still to get 40 points on the board as quickly as possible. So this win was really important. Another goal for our Danish centre-half, Joachim Andersen, a fantastic finish. Obviously, Ebbs plays the ball in from the free kick. The ball takes a little deflection. There's a little nick from a defender. Joachim adjusts so beautifully and first time strikes it past Onana. Yes, I know it took a little nick on the way through, but it was still a fantastic strike. And I think just building on what's been a really good start to the campaign for him. I think for me, the most impressive thing about this victory was the fact that it didn't feel as though we were clinging on at the end. We felt fairly sort of controlled and assured. And yes, obviously, Man United had a few chances. There are a couple of moments where the ball bounced about our 6-yard box and it could have possibly ended a little bit differently. Thinking in particular about that Tyrick Mitchell one at the back post. But yeah, I thought on the whole, it was a really, really good performance. We managed to keep Man United at arm's length. And yes, I know they've had a difficult start to the campaign, but when you look at the players they've got in their side and you look at how easily they took us apart a few days earlier, it was a fantastic result.
And as you mentioned, Joachim Andersen has been one of the best centre-halves in Europe in terms of his form at the start of the season, depending on what metrics you're looking at. But, generally he has put in those kind of performances that would, consider him as being right up there in terms of individuals playing in that position. And obviously the win at Old Trafford was a landmark, if you will, for Roy Hodgson, who seems to just have a thing about getting results away to Manchester United in recent times. And obviously with Roy staying on in the position as a manager into another year, and well, I'll ask you what you make of how well he has done personally, really, to start off this campaign, because, obviously we ended the previous season in such fine fashion and he stayed on because of that. So how do you think Roy Hodgson has done to kick off this campaign?
I think he's done incredibly well, to be honest with you. I think obviously the end of last season was fantastic, but I think when he took over the side, they were at a very low ebb. And obviously sometimes it can be difficult to turn things around. But at the same time, when they are at such a low ebb, if you kind of make a difference, it's a very obvious difference. And I think also when you look at the fixtures we had, a bit of good coaching, a bit more belief, and you could see Palace picking up results in those games. And of course they did. Obviously, in the summer, we lost Wilfried Zaha. I think that kind of blow was softened by the fact that he wasn't available towards the back end of the last campaign. But some other senior players have moved on as well, the likes of James McArthur, Luka Milivojevic. The players that we've brought in, yes, obviously Jefferson Lerma's come in, and we brought in Dean Henderson and Rob Holding towards the end of the window, but we haven't seen a great deal of them for a number of reasons. Of course, Matthias França hasn't been available yet. So when you look at what he's actually been working with, Michael Olise out too, he's actually kind of been operating with his hands tied behind his back. He hasn't had many options to change things up off the bench. So, yeah, I think he's done really well. Obviously, he missed the game against Aston Villa because of ill health. It's fantastic to see him back the week after. I think for me, the only criticism would probably be moving on to the Forest game, of course, the fact that there are times where I do think he does need to be a little bit quicker to change things up. I know that Palace have used the fewest players in the Premier League so far this season. I'd imagine also you've probably made the fewest subs in the Premier League too. So I do think that when you are operating with a smaller squad, maybe you do need to be more willing to change things up. Maybe does need to make a few more subs, maybe make them a little bit earlier. But I do think on the whole, given what he's been working with, he's done a fantastic job so far.
And as you say, the Nottingham Forest game, another goalless draw in that one, and clearly more injury woes going into it with Joe Ward and Eberechi Eze and Doucouré not available for the game on top of the injuries we already had. And then in the game itself, more players, picking up injuries as well. So again, it goes back to what we said about the Fulham game, really, that actually going into the campaign, you would look at those home games against teams that you would expect to be in and around you, so to speak. And you'd like to think that possibly 3 points might be on the cards, but actually, with all the circumstances around it, taking a point from it was pretty reasonable.
Yeah, it was. As you said, at the start of the campaign, you look at home games against the likes of Fulham and Nottingham Forest, and you'd like to think that from the two of those, you're picking up 4 points. Unfortunately, we only picked up 2 points, 2 goalless draws. But I do think, given the circumstances, especially the Forest one, this was actually a really good point because, as you said, we were missing so many first team players. Those 3 injuries in that week building up to that game really did knock us. So, yeah, I think it was a good point. And I think also at this point, we do need to mention Sam Johnstone as well, because he's had a really strong start to the campaign. He made a few key saves in this game. They weren't unbelievable saves, but they were good saves. And that's what he's been producing on a regular basis. Obviously, 3 clean sheets in a row for Palace heading into this international break. He's kept another one for England against Australia. Fantastic to see him getting that recognition. I do feel as though when he's in this sort of form, when the likes of Gahey and Anderson are available, whoever else is on the pitch, we do have a solid base, and that does give us half a chance of getting something.
Well, you've sort of preempted my next question, really, about Sam Johnstone's form. And, obviously talked about Anderson, and you'd have to say that aside from him, Sam Johnstone has probably been our player of the season so far with the performances he's put in. And again, it's something we've spoken about on the podcast itself, that his form is slightly making a mockery of spending the amount of money we did on a backup goalkeeper, when potentially if you just loan some cover in, then you could spend that money elsewhere and maybe some of the results look different because we've got a few more options in other areas of the pitch. Albeit this scenario, of course, stemmed from our former number one, Vicente Guaita, refusing to play, as Roy Hodgson said in one interview, and subsequently leaving the club.
Yeah, I think obviously the situation with Vinny has possibly started all of this, because I think if he'd been happy to stay, we'd have been happy to have Sam Johnstone and Vinny as our 2 kind of main goalkeepers, with Remy Matthews and Joe Whitworth in the background. You may find that also if Vinny had stayed, Joe Whitworth might have gone out on loan like Owen Goodman. So yeah, there's always a kind of ripple effect, isn't there? But I do think that Sam Johnstone has had an excellent start to the campaign. It was interesting, the kind of comments he made about feeling more settled now. And I think that's something that we really sort of underestimate when talking about footballers. Yes, obviously Sam Johnstone is English, but he's Northern. He came through at Man United. He's been playing for the likes of West Brom. He's not used to living in London. And, little things like settling in with your family, getting your kids settled in school, all those sorts of things kind of play a part in player performance. So he is looking really good at the start of this campaign. It's been fantastic to see sort of the love that he's been getting off the Palace fans, off the back of those comments he made after the game against United. And then, of course, the international recognition as well that's come. You'd have to say it's thoroughly deserved. Obviously, the Dean Henderson situation one is really frustrating, because I made a comment on the pod a few weeks ago about the fact that the only thing more annoying or frustrating than spending £20 million on a backup goalkeeper is not being able to use said backup goalkeeper because they're injured. So yeah, listen, we don't want to judge Dean Henderson just yet, because he's still a young goalkeeper. He's got a lot of potential. He's very, very early into his Palace career, but it is frustrating given the fact that we did clearly need reinforcements in other areas of the pitch.
And of course, after the international break coming up, we've got a couple of tricky fixtures, taking on the likes of Newcastle and Tottenham Hotspur, who have obviously had decent starts to the season across various competitions. The crumb of comfort, I guess, is perhaps that we are going to see a few players, hopefully, touching wood, return to the first team. And Matheus França, as you mentioned, the Brazilian, who has got a lot of pressure and expectation on him, perhaps because of the fact that he's effectively Wilfried Zaha's replacement. He almost needs to come in and hit the ground running, doesn't he? But having seen a couple of clips of him in training, seems to have, magic feet. Can't wait to see what he can produce out on the pitch.
Yeah, listen, I don't think we should get too carried away based on the odd little clip from training, but yeah, obviously it'll be lovely to have him back. Personally, I'm not expecting him to tear it up straight away. I think that would be unfair. We just said about Sam Johnson settling in. Well, Matheus França is a very young boy. He's 19 years old. He's come from Brazil, coming to the Premier League, coming to London. It's going to be very, very different for him. So in a strange way, you might find the time he has actually spent out injured in a way might have helped, because it might have allowed him to kind of settle in without the added burden of playing Premier League football. But yeah, listen, I'm not expecting him to be anywhere near his best in those first few weeks. But I do think that when you think about the rest of the team, and you think about the fan base as well, I think it'll be a real lift to the fans to see Matheus França and just to have a few glimpses or little snippets of what he can do. A bit like what we saw from Jez against Nottingham Forest, those few moments that give you a little bit of hope and a bit of confidence moving forward. So yeah, that would be really exciting to see. As you said, we need to get a few more first team players back, because when you look at those games, they are going to be really tricky. Newcastle away is always tough. When you look at some of the results they've picked up recently, that's going to be a really tricky game. And then, of course, Big Ange Postecoglou, his Spurs side, currently top of the league, coming to Selhurst Park on Friday night. That's going to be another really tricky one. So, yeah, they are tough games. But I do think that if we can keep those kind of key players fit, the likes of Johnson, Guéhi, Anderson, you'd like to think that we're going to have a solid base. And if we do have that solid base, you'd like to think that we'll be able to stay in games. As we know, if you stay in games, you've always got a chance of nicking something.
Yeah, and we hope we'll see Michael Elise, of course, back in a Palace shirt very soon, and I'm sure he'll get a fantastic reception when he does, obviously off the back of signing a new contract and turning down that move to Chelsea, which takes me on to the league table, Matt, because looking below us in the table, there is Chelsea and there is Manchester United, 9th in the ladder at this stage of the season, albeit it doesn't mean too much because, it's early days, but I think we've got to be pretty happy with that, haven't we?
Yeah, we do. Absolutely. I think when Roy was reappointed, when they made the decision to give him another year, they spoke about the fact that their target would be to finish in the top half. And we've spoken in recent weeks about the fact that that might be a little bit tricky given the lack of squad depth. But for us to be 9th at this stage of the season is really positive. Obviously, a couple of results could change that, but we've already got a decent gap between us and that bottom 4. So that's really nice to see. I think, listen, for us this season, it is going to be the classic, get to 40 points as quickly as possible and then see how high we can finish. Personally, I do think that the top half might be a bit too much to ask, just based on the strength of some of the other sides that will be competing for that. But yeah, you'd like to think we're going to be in and around that kind of discussion for finishing in the top half. Obviously, we've got some tough games coming up, but when you look a little bit further kind of onto the horizon, there are some more winnable games coming up. And you'd like to think that we will have the likes of maybe Eze, Elise back for some of those games. So that could make a massive difference.
And just to commend you as well, Matt, on your predictions so far. I normally ask you at the end of each podcast what you think the next result is going to be. Generally, I tell you to try and be optimistic. And you predicted us to take 11 points. So far, we've taken 12. So we're pretty happy with that. In terms of our fantasy league as well, our team called Palace Trophy via the official app, I think I haven't double checked this, but I've been in and around the top of the ladder, and I'm pretty happy with how I've started in terms of the fantasy football. So for those of you that are looking to try and finish above me, good luck to you. I had to play my wild card in recent weeks just to try and stay on top of the table. And as well, Crystal Palace women have had a fantastic start to their season in the WSL Championship. In recent weeks, they've been absolutely banging goals in left, right, and centre, and they're 1 point off top with a game in hand as well. So ultimately, could be top of the pile, and once that fixture has been played, so they've had a fantastic start to their campaign too.
Yeah, they have. And obviously, it's been a summer of change for Crystal Palace women. Big turnover of players, new manager, new kind of head of women's football, new ground as well. So, yeah, really positive start to the season for them. Obviously, on the pod, we always like to mention the other teams within the football club. It hasn't been a fantastic start to the season for the under 18s and the under 21s. They have also been suffering with quite a few injuries, a bit like the first team, but definitely starting to see a few more of those players coming back. I do think that in the coming weeks, they will start to get a few more results, but we've seen some really bright performances from the likes of Rashawn Matherin, Triless B, of course, Zach Marsh as well, our young goal scorer who's been getting international recognition. So, yes, it has been a tough start to the campaign for them, but there have been some bright sparks too.
Yeah, certainly so. Well, Matt, thanks for chatting today. And if you've never listened to the Team Crystal Palace podcast before, we're on Spotify and iTunes. And every week, normally it gets released on a Tuesday morning. We'll bring you our analysis on the games from the weekend, and particularly, obviously, the men's team game in the Premier League. And we look ahead to the fixture coming up as well. In the week, you can keep in touch with our thoughts on Facebook. It's just simply Team Crystal Palace. On X or Twitter, it's TC Palace Pod, and we put loads of our thoughts up there on all the news of the week as well. So you can keep in touch with us. You can interact with us on there likewise. So yeah, thanks very much everybody for tuning in to our very first episode on the YouTube channel. And well, I guess it's off the back of COVID, really. Normally it's at this point I say stay well and have a great week. So yes, stay well. Lovely to chat to you today, and do check out the podcast when we're back again after that game against Newcastle. We'll speak to you again very soon.